I'm Susanne Gleemore, and we are all together as the steering committee for the community conversations on race and reconciliation. We're here to talk about our own early experiences and messages that we've received about race, and to unpack them a little bit in conversation with one another and to share how those things have shaped our lives. And so this will be the first of lots of conversations we'll be having. And we're hoping to invite you all to join us in having your own conversations or to connect with us on Facebook to participate in conversations about race. So, Renz, what about you? Can you share something about looking back? What were your earliest messages or maybe formative experiences about race?
Wow, Susanne, there are so many of them, and they go back so far that they tend to run together in my head. So I'll just kind of give you a few poignant memories that I can recall. One was clearly where I lived. We called it the Ville, and it was across the tracks. Two, there were designated signs to let me know I was a Negro. I was the 6-letter version of that, limitations and boundaries. Where my father worked at as a cook, and we could not eat there. All of these come running back to me. But one of the most poignant ones was when I was about 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10. And I was walking with some, was I by myself or with some friends? No, I was by myself, walking from Whitetown. And there was a clear demarcation about where the Ville stopped and Whitetown ended. And I could hear a little white child, approximately 6 years old, I think it was a female, saying, and I'm gonna have to use the vernacular terms, "Hey, mommy, there goes a nigger. Can I pull his tail?" I remember that. That was one of my most poignant experiences that identified me as a nigger. It was obviously very, very racist. In junior high school, I remember when we integrated, and I was just shocked to find out that before school was out, all the little white kids, or the greater majority of them, had summer jobs. We didn't. And when summer came, oftentimes we couldn't find those jobs. And lastly, I'll say going into high school, and I found out about this thing called college prep. And I went to the counselor and I asked her about how I structure my classes, for the college prep format. And she told me, "You don't need college prep to be a janitor." Those were the things that introduced me to race. Thank you, Susanne.
Wow, thanks for sharing. That's huge. Jonalu, what about you?
I grew up very aware of race. I grew up in Virginia in the 1950s and 60s. So there was a lot of attention to race then. I'm always kind of amazed when there are people who didn't even realize they were white. There's that standard question a lot of times, an anti-racism question: when did you first realize you were white? And it's like, I've always known I was white. I've known I was white since I knew I was a girl, So like when I was 2, maybe, it was a major identifying factor in everything that you did. I remember the messages that I remember were mostly subtle, though. It was, except there were things I remember. There was a black, when I would visit Oklahoma in the summer where my grandmother lived, there was a black town right next to him. And there was this, it was called Tatum's. And it was like, "Oh, you want to stay away from Tatum's." You know, it was that, that, you know, like something bad would happen there. It was a black town. And there were subtle messages about you didn't want a black baby doll. Who would want a black baby doll? You know, there were those kind of subtle messages. I remember in 5th grade, there was an African-American boy in my class. And people wanted to touch his hair because it was something that they hadn't seen before. Because they were just, we had kind of token integration then. And we didn't fully integrate till I was like 6th grade. And at that point, my parents moved me to a private school. So I got really definite messages about staying away, about being careful, about Black people being different, all these kinds of things. So that was in the American South in the 50s and 60s. I imagine Joab has a very different experience coming from a different, an entirely different background. So Joab, what was your experience?
Thank you, Jonalu. I think just like your experience, Jonalu, I was born Black, and I thought I was basically proud to be Black, and I didn't see anything wrong with it, right? But allow me to say this, I struggled a little bit trying to identify a more perfect incident that will resonate very well with the question that has been asked. But I would say my initial experience with race, and I would add racism as well, have largely been, I would say, subtle, overt, you know, some kind of hidden, not very direct. I hope you all remember the sentiments that were expressed by the K-State professor from Bangladesh, the guy who was one of our panelists. And you remember what he said about his experience here in the US. And he said, you know, for him, he's never had a problem. I mean, he's liked it all along. I almost want to say that because really I've not had very direct kind of, you know, incidents that really affect me as a Black person. However, I'll point out 2 things or 3 quickly. One, having been colonized by the British, because Kenya was colonized by the British, I was introduced to these race issues, you know, using what I would call the superior-inferior lenses. I mean, that the white people, we were meant to understand that the white people were superior to us, and we as Black Kenyans were kind of inferior. I mean, that's how it was meant to be. I mean, right from the beginning. It's because they were our colonial masters, and we were the subjects in a country, right? But 2 close incidents, quick one again, that I experienced in the US, so first I went to school in India, by the way, all the way, lived there for 7 years. And I remember as a young person, sometimes walking on, you know, out there in the city, kids would call us names. And I remember, you know, they would call us names like, and allow me to use this word, like monkeys and that kind of thing. And for me, I mean, I was simply, because I was a young person, I was simply also retort by calling them names too. I mean, I was young anyway by then. So I didn't care about that. They call us monkeys, we call them something else. And it was just like some kind of a game, right? It didn't affect me much. But I remember the year 2017, I was traveling to Kenya through Chicago airport, and Chicago to Amsterdam in Netherlands. And just as we were about to enter, get into the plane, this security officer picks me from the line. We were all getting into the plane, and most of the people are white. So he picks me from the line and calls me. He tells me to step aside, and these guys are let in while he wants to interrogate me. And the question he asked me was, are you carrying like $10,000 with you right now? And I'm like, wow. Of course, I didn't have any $10,000 with me, right? Now, to me, I would say I felt embarrassed. I almost thought, why was I the only one asked that question? Why did he pick me from the rest of all these guys here, right? But I think I'll say I was only embarrassed with it. It didn't really affect me as such, right? And most importantly, did I feel bad about it? Was I disappointed? No. Did I feel bad about it? No. It's like just embarrassed about it. I know I've taken more than 2 minutes. I think that's my story for now.
Joe, it's interesting what you just described about what kids were calling you when you were a kid going to school, because for me, growing up as a kid in Germany and going to school in Germany, there was very little diversity. The only people that were different than all the little white kids in school were, occasionally there were some Turkish kids that were in school with us. So they didn't really look any different. The only way you would know that they were different, and we were little enough that you know, there was nobody. Religion wasn't the main difference. It was ethnicity, and so you would know if they would speak Turkish with their family members, if somebody was coming to pick them up, or maybe their lunches would be different. So they were eating different food. So my early messages, I was reminded in part by your story, came from comics. There were some comics that were super, super popular. I think in English they're called Tintin or Rin Tin Tin or something, but the original comic books were written by a Belgian, but they were translated into lots of languages. And in German, they were hugely popular. It was just staple literature. Everybody had them, everybody read them, and we loved them. And anybody that was Black in those comics was African, and was it was the grossest caricature that you could imagine, right? The faces did not even, they looked like monkey faces. They didn't look like human faces at all. The coloring, the way they were, it was, and you know what? It was the only visual, and nobody ever said to me or to anybody else, hey, this isn't what people are really like. This isn't really what it's like. It was just, here's this comic and they're really funny and blah, 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 blah. So we grew up with these comics, and just, I don't think I realized until I was probably a young adult looking at the comics again, being horrified at what I saw. But I don't think I really understood that was what I was, that was the soup I was swimming in terms of the messages that I was getting, that I was absorbing. So it was from literature, and that makes me think about, there were a couple of other characters in books that I read when I was a kid. One contained a biracial child it was clearly a biracial child, because it was the child of a civilized European with an African jungle king, and the skin was checkered like a chessboard. That was the character. And then there was another book, hugely popular, won tons of awards, and the main character was a little Black boy who arrived across the sea in a cardboard box. You know, it was just this child that swam up in a, I look back on that now and I'm just amazed that was my messaging when I was little. I had to grow a lot of years and learn a lot of things to begin to unpack some of that stuff before I realized just how, how formative that was early on, and what all I had to undo with all of that.
I must say, listening to what you've said about all this, I'm thinking that my childhood was, by and large, pretty benighted, I guess. I did go to integrated schools, but there weren't very many kids of color in them. In my kindergarten year, I was at a school in the Argentine district in Kansas City, Kansas, and it must have been integrated. But you know, I don't have a recollection. I mean, I don't have an image of there being lots of kids of color around, and I don't know why that is. I mean, maybe I just wasn't aware of it, or maybe I was young enough that it didn't matter. But I do know that race became an issue for me, actually in a church that I'd gone to with my grandmother when I was, I think, 11, 12 years old. Would have been 1956, maybe. before church started this particular morning, there was a big hoo-ha out, at the back of the church, when people were coming in, and of course I really couldn't see what was going on, and it got kind of loud, and I finally asked my grandma, who was there with, what's going on, and she said, well, there was some I think she used the word Negro. There were some Negro people trying to get into the church, and I was, of course, puzzled by that. Church is church. I mean, anybody comes to church. Well, not in this particular church. Black people weren't allowed. And I don't know, somehow that colored things, not to make a pun there, but that really changed things for me. I think probably from a religion perspective, because I never went back to church with her there. I mean, I was really offended by it. It just didn't fit with what I'd been taught, or with my ignorance, I suppose. But and I realized actually this was after teaching at the university for many years, sort of reflecting on childhood, unpacking stuff as it was, you talked about, Susanne. I remember going to my grandfather's funeral in Springfield, Missouri, with my mom, and we had to ride the bus from Kansas City to Springfield. And we rode that bus Jim Crow. We rode in the very back seat. There were seats available forward. And it never occurred to me then, and I was a blue-eyed, blonde-haired kid, but my mom was kind of dark complected, and I don't know what the story is. My mother was gone, so I couldn't go back and ask her when I had the sudden realization that was a weird experience. But we were in Missouri, and so we were in the back of the bus, and it didn't have any meaning for me when I was a kid, but as I, began teaching this stuff and learning about this stuff and about what those experiences were, that came back to me, and that is so totally one of the biggest questions I have from my childhood. What in the world was going on? There was something there. My mother took us there. We sat there. I said, how come we're back here? She said, it's close to the bathroom. And that was that. So, for 40 years that laid there, and finally it sprung out one day as I was watching the Eyes on the Prize video series, and I thought, holy cow, that is totally bizarre. So that's sort of those weird experiences. But, growing up basically insulated from all that. I mean, not like the experiences of Joab or Lorenza, and not like the experiences of Jonalu. Just nothing there. Remember the magazines on the table, the weekly photo magazine, Look magazine, I think it was. And of course, we didn't have much TV in those days, but seeing the pictures of the stuff going on down south, in the mid 50s. I remember those very vividly. But again, that wasn't a piece of the reality I lived in.
Interesting. Sounds like it was on the one hand removed, and on the other hand, it was real close by when you encountered that dissonance between the values that you were being taught and then the real life didn't match up. It didn't match up at all. What about you, Jodi? You had a different experience, right?
Yeah, well, a little bit, because I grew up in Wichita, so the area was a little bit the same. I had some different experiences in Missouri, but Wichita they tried really hard to be integrated, and they would do it by birthdays, where they would bus, because the Wichita was very segregated. Like there was a definite white part of town, definite black part of town, but then they would bus children based on birthdays. Every year you would see if your birthday was called, and then you would get bused to the other side of town and back and forth. But and yet it remained a very racist town. But I grew up in a multiracial family. So my earliest racial influences, I think, would have had to do with that. Like what I perceived as the favorited child in our family was he was biracial. So I always remember my family talking about how beautiful he was. And he had, you know, and they always talked about his beautiful curly brown hair and his beautiful big brown eyes, and he had the perfect skin tone, and just everything about him was great. And so I don't know, I guess it left me pretty self-conscious about my stick straight light hair and white skin and blue eyes. So I had a little bit different experience with that. So that would have been my earliest. But I don't know that I really thought about it as race, you know, it was just family. So.
Yeah, interesting. The inside, from a child's perspective, the inside world in your little family versus the outside world and what's going on all around us.
Well, you know, I grew up, I guess you could actually say I was a privileged little black child. Sports is a huge equalizer. You know that it's an equalizer, and it's a tool also to keep people down. Because I didn't realize that you know, just because I could play sports, I fit along everywhere. But you know, when you start realizing and coming to the realization of who you are, and you figure out that it's not what you think it is. The big eye-opening experience for me was television. Did a lot of television, from Ed Sullivan to the Jackson 5, all those people. I did, like, we can entertain. There was also a lot more entertainment because, you know, we had poets like Langston Hughes, and then we had blaxploitation at the same time. So I have an older sister that's listening to Gil Scott Herring about the revolution, and I'm out there playing with the kids that we're supposed to be revolting about. So I had a constant barrage of mixed messages until you finally figure out what are they hiding from us? What's my root? So it was probably a result of television. I can actually say I'm a product of blaxploitation and sports media. You know, it all comes clear when somebody says, especially, and I was a huge Mets fan. There was there was a guy called Don Clendenin, and he was an amazing left-handed batter. And the first thing I heard from one white person was like, "Damn, that nigga sure can hit." And it kind of brought me to the realization that I probably need to figure out where I'm from, what it's coming from. And there's a lot of eye awakenings that I had, but sports brought me in, and television pacified me for a long time. I loved the Little Rascals, but it didn't figure out that buckwheat was kind of bad. So when you get those constant awakenings, it kind of reminds you that you need to look a little farther and look a little harder. And that's my 2 minutes. So Donna, what do you think? We've done a lot of multimedia stuff together.
Yeah, media, TV. I was born in 1952, and I was raised in a predominantly white, affluent college town in Southern California. But we didn't live on the affluent end, but on the other side of the tracks, in tract housing that ended at a field owned by a family that was of Mexican heritage, who they raised strawberries, and they ran a family grocery store where my dad would go for beer and occasionally homemade tamales. And I guess my earliest formative experience of either racial or ethnic difference was based on language, because both of my grandfathers spoke fluent Spanish, and they would use it in that store. One of my grandfathers lived in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood of LA. And now our family had no ancestry from Spain or Latin America, but it was that my one grandfather was raised in Mexico while his dad worked on the railroad. And my other grandfather had learned Spanish from the ranchers in the desert hills where his parents homesteaded in Southern California. But I love to listen to them learn to speak. I love to hear them speak Spanish. And I recognized when I went into the store with them that the response they got speaking Spanish was so much more cordial and attentive than when my father or us kids came in and out. And this neighbor family that ran the store was exceptionally successful. Their sons starred in track and field, and their daughters were beautiful and popular. And I learned early on, though, that behind their field and their house was the barrio, which was a poor, predominantly Mexican-American neighborhood where many of the kids attended Catholic schools. I had no friends from those blocks. And though I was free to roam by myself in areas away from housing and traffic, I stayed away because it was considered dangerous. We were talking about that before. We were told about a sailor that was home on leave who had taken the wrong turn and he was attacked there as an outsider. And my brother, who had a childhood friend from the barrio, told me that ended when the friend in junior high began to hang out with a gang that my brother couldn't or wouldn't join. So up till about 1963, I don't think I ever heard the words race or racism spoken. But then through TV, my exposure was through media. My parents didn't have a TV, but an early formative experience was watching at my grandfather's house the news that showed Black children being attacked by police with water hoses and dogs. And that was my first rude awakening to racist violence. Then came the Watts riots in 1965. My great grandmother lived in South Central LA, and our neighbors were Black, and she resisted any suggestions that she leave then or later. But I think because my dad was a jazz musician and a college professor and had been in World War II, he valued creativity and individuality more than anything else, and that's what he tried to pass on to us. So that's basically my story.
Wow, I love hearing you guys' experience so much because they're so varied, they're so different.